Hi, everyone, and welcome to the webinar on the new UN report just out yesterday called Coral Reef Restoration as a Strategy to Improve Ecosystem Services, a Guide to Coral Restoration Methods. This webinar is co-sponsored by the Reef Resilience Network, NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program, and the International Coral Reef Initiative. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Elizabeth Shaver, and I'm the science lead for the Reef Resilience Network and the host for today's webinar. Before we begin, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items. Today's webinar will be an hour and 30 minutes long. It is being recorded, and the recording will be sent out to our mailing list after the webinar, and it will also be posted to our website. There will be a question and answer period at the end of the presentation, and there will also be opportunity for additional Q&A online on the Reef Resilience Network forum, which is an interactive online community for coral reef managers and experts from around the world. There are two ways, sorry, next slide, Margot. There are two ways you can ask questions during the Q&A session. You can ask a question in the question box anytime throughout the webinar, and we will keep track of these for the end of the presentation. The other option is that you can raise your hand during the question and answer session, and I will call on you to ask your question during that time. You raise your hand by clicking on the small hand icon on the toolbar that's next to your name. If you are having technical difficulties at any time, such as trouble hearing or seeing the slides, please type a message in the question box and we'll try to help resolve those issues with you. Next. Before we go into the presentations, we actually have a few questions for you. We're interested in learning a little bit about the participants in the audience today. So please share with us a bit about yourself with a few short poll questions. All right, the first one is about asking about your work. So please select one of the following. Are you a marine resource manager, restoration practitioner, scientist or researcher, student, or other? Just give a few minutes for everyone to answer the poll question. All right, so the majority of responses that we have, there's scientists and researchers in the audience today. A lot of people who describe themselves as other, lots of students. We also have a good number of practitioners and marine resource managers with us. Great, so we have another question. Okay. All right, the next question is, what is your work related to restoration? You can choose between, I am currently conducting coral reef restoration, I am planning to start a new coral reef restoration project, I'm interested in restoration but have not started the process, or you're realizing you are in the wrong webinar today. Okay, so the majority of people are generally interested in coral reef restoration, followed by currently conducting restoration projects. A few that are starting or planning to start, and then we have 1% who said they're in the wrong webinar. So hopefully that's just someone with a really good sense of humor today. And then we have one final question for you. In your opinion, what is the most important action to help coral reefs? Is it mitigating climate change, reducing local threats and stressors, coral reef restoration, or a combination of the above? All right. The vast majority, 70% of you, said a combination of all three. And then followed by mitigating climate change. 10% said reducing local threats and 2% said coral reef restoration. It was really interesting. Thank you everyone for answering those polls and telling us a bit about yourselves. So let's now get into the presentation. Today, next slide, please. Today we are lucky to have 3 speakers who are all authors on this new UN report. We will first hear from Gabriel Grimstitch, who is the Program Management Officer for the UN Environment Program. Next, we will hear from Dr. Ian McLeod, who is an Assistant Director for Trop Water and Associate Professor at James Cook University. And then we will hear from Dr. Margot Hein, who's the lead consultant for marine ecosystem restoration research and consulting, and the lead author on this guide. So thank you very much, Gabriel, Ian, and Margot, for your time today to share with us the major findings from this report. And I'll go ahead and hand things over to Gabriel now.
Thank you, Liz, and good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, everybody, wherever you are in the world. Thanks for tuning in to this exciting webinar, and thank you very much for your interest in our work. It's really good to see so many people online and listening in. As you all know, coral reefs are in decline globally, and they're extremely vulnerable to climate change. I don't think that's a surprise to anyone. In fact, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change projects that with 1.5 degrees warming, we could lose between 70 and 90% of existing live coral cover. With 2-degree warming, we could lose up to 99% of live coral cover if corals don't adapt to a warming world. And we know that we just can't afford to lose coral reefs and the ecosystems that they provide to hundreds of millions of people around the world, as well as the thousands of species that they house, up to a quarter of marine biodiversity. Now, to combat this decline, coral restoration is increasingly being advocated for. There are many methods, there are many projects around the world. However, there is a limited understanding of the effectiveness of coral reef restoration efforts globally, and especially limited understanding of the effectiveness in delivery of ecosystem services. So this lack of, this gap in knowledge was recognized in 2019 by the 4th United Nations Environment Assembly in Nairobi, Kenya. And specifically, there was a resolution passed, Resolution 413, on the sustainable management of coral reefs. And this resolution requested from the member states included a request to UNEP and to the International Coral Reef Initiative to better define best practices for coral restoration for the maintenance of ecosystem services. So the report that was launched yesterday and this webinar are direct outcomes of this resolution to have UNEP and ICRI work on a better understanding of coral reef restoration methodologies. Moreover, we are at the beginning of the UN Decades of Ecosystem Restoration and the UN Decade on Ocean Science for Sustainable Development. And I'm very proud to say that this report is the first report of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. It's the first report that actually has the logo of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration on it. So it's a great way to start the decade and to highlight the importance and the plight of coral reefs. This report also represents the nexus of the 2 decades, the intersection of science and of restoration. It provides an overview of the best available knowledge in the field and provides recommendations as well as case studies for the use of coral restoration as a management strategy for managers, practitioners, policymakers, and funding agencies. The report was written by over 20 experts, and which included an advisory committee, and it went through a rigorous review process. So I'm very happy to now pass on to the next speaker, but first we'll have a short video about the report and to give a bit of background. Thank you.
Thanks, Gabriel, for that introduction. And just saying, I'm very grateful to be here. We are actually due to be hit with a cyclone right about now, but luckily it's fizzled out. So this is great to be here. So along with the report and the animated video, we also produced a policy brief. This is a high-level summary, and this will be translated into all of the UN languages. So one of my roles is a co-chair for the International Coral Reef Initiative Committee for Reef Restoration. So ICRI is an informal partnership between nations and organizations that strives to preserve coral reefs and related ecosystems around the world. ICRI has over 90 members and is one of the main organizations encouraging collaboration and knowledge sharing in the reef space. So ICRI's first major interaction with reef restoration was in 2001 with the ICRI decision on reef restoration. This recognised that restoration had a role to play and called for guidelines to be developed. This was followed in 2005 with the resolution on reef restoration. This expressed concern about the lack of evidence of success for coral restoration. A lot of it was focused around some of the electrodeposition projects, which were getting a lot of press at that time. This document also stressed that restoration shouldn't be over-promoted so that it attracts funds away from important conservation projects. So those two documents helped build the momentum for widely used guidelines such as the 2010 Rehabilitation Manual by Alice Edwards. So we know that the world has changed since 2010 and not in a good way for coral reefs around the world. But coral restoration has also changed a lot over the last decade. In 2018, ICRI passed a new plan of action that included some goals such as inventory of reef restoration activities, which has now been updated and added to the Restoration Hub on the ICRI website, and includes over 400 coral restoration projects from around the tropics. We also updated the 2005 resolution, recognising the changing environment and the innovations and improvements in coral restoration. And of course, collaboration with UNEP and many other organisations for this report. So the aims of a new report to provide an overview of best available knowledge on coral reef restoration, and also provide recommendations of how coral reef restoration can be used to secure ecosystem services. And so the first part of the report just describes what coral restoration is. So coral reef restoration is a type of ecological restoration defined by the Society of Ecological Restoration as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed. So the latest guidelines from SUR present ecological restoration on a continuum of interventions that aim to improve biodiversity, ecological integrity, and ecosystem services. And on this continuum figure, you can see that restoration fits right on the right-hand side after efforts have been made to reduce impacts and improve ecosystem management. That's still valid for coral restoration, but it's also really challenging because we know that one of the main drivers for coral reef decline is climate change. And we know that that hasn't been mitigated, and we're still facing decades of warming, even if we take really strong mitigation action now. So that's why we're really pushing for this combined. We need to take action now to help preserve what we've got so that the system can help heal itself as we deal with the global climate crisis. So one of our first tasks for this report was to provide a sort of realistic definition of what coral restoration is. We landed at this definition that presents restoration as a way to secure resilience and services, but not to restore reefs to a historic baseline, which is pretty unrealistic in the face of rising pressures and climate change. So that real focus on ecosystem services and function. We also redrew the restoration continuum for coral reef systems. Previously, restoration was mostly split into either active or passive. Passive being some of the management activities like mitigating pollution. Got some feedback that that's made it sound like those passive actions were less important. So we've just rejigged that and called that proactive and reactive. Proactive is helping to prevent further damage and encourage reefs to heal themselves. And some of the more reactive activities and actions most of the coral restoration practices are fitting into more reactive. Okay. Also, as part of this section was looking at the main goals. So a lot of this information came from that review of 400 case studies of coral restoration projects around the world. And so we split these into to 4 groups. Of course, the goal is the ultimate impact you hope to achieve by conducting interventions, and we really want to have that focus on the medium to long term. So, it could be 5 to 20 years for coral reefs. So the categories of goals we had were social economic goals, ecological goals, goals focused on climate change adaptation, and goals around disturbances, either something like a ship strike or extreme weather event, but also to mitigate known disturbances perhaps associated with development. These goals will be looping back to these goals because we put effort into linking different types of methods with goals, hopefully to help guide research projects in the future. We also, based on that review that was led by Lisa Bostrom-Anderson, we also described some of the main methods that have been used so far. These range from direct transplantation, which is transplanting corals or fragments without an intermediate nursery phase, coral gardening, which is transplantation plus a phase where corals are grown in either on land or in water, fragmented, so you can increase the number of corals to plant out. Substrate addition, so some of the artificial reef structures, but this also includes those electrode deposition methods and green engineering. Substrate manipulation to help facilitate recovery, such as substrate stabilization or macroalgae removal to free up space and competition for coral juveniles. And some of the increasingly popular coral propagation methods, which are using or larval seeding, either inoculating surfaces and then deploying those, or actually larval release, releasing larvae directly at a restoration site. So these are just the most widely used methods today, but it's really a rapidly moving space, and there's a lot of new interventions proposed and in research and development. So there's a lot of new emerging interventions that are being tested experimentally across various scales, from individual corals, for example, using genetics, reproduction, physiology, to coral populations, reef communities, and ecosystems. So there's been some really large global efforts here. For example, the US National Academy of Science did a thorough review of all possible interventions, as we did in Australia through the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program. And many of these interventions are now in the R&D phase through the RAP program in Australia. However, many of these interventions are years away from being ready for implementation. So that's why we kept the focus of this report forward-looking, but in terms of the methods we're describing, we're talking about what's available now. So altogether, the portfolio of interventions and methods that fall under the term coral restoration is broadening, and there are many options for interventions available either alone or concurrently to help reefs assist reefs moving from a degraded to a healthy state. The second section of the report focuses on presenting current challenges and opportunities associated with coral reef restoration. The first challenge is the limited scale at which coral restoration can be applied both across space and time. The main drivers for the challenges around spatial scale is just the cost of coral restoration, and also just the ability to scale it up. So we know that the challenges facing coral reefs are absolutely massive. whereas doing anything in the water tends to be pretty expensive and difficult. And from our reviews as well, we found that the median time for projects being reported on was about 18 months, and we know that projects can take a lot longer than that to, or corals take a lot longer than that to recover. This has really often been driven by just the amount of money or the granting period, and also that a lot of these projects in the past have been focused on research projects, so maybe they're limited by the maybe it was someone's master's degree, so that was a 2-year project. We know that there's a lot of scaling up and a lot of effort to increase the efficiency and effectiveness of coral restoration, either improving current methods, but also developing new technologies like some of these examples from the RRF program in Australia as well, trying to see if we can take out the diving aspect, which can be one of the limitations to scale. And another thing that we're seeing happen as well is just a change from short projects to thinking about like longer term planning, and also a change from that traditional thought of what restoration is, sort of go in there, fix it up and then walk away. We may need to be thinking about longer term stewardship for areas where we do continued maintenance, continued effort, and actually use multiple techniques, coral restoration and other management techniques to keep coral reefs healthy as they face so many challenges. The second challenge was around just a lack of information and standards. That was made it really difficult to compare projects and share knowledge and share lessons and sort of work out what's the most effective techniques. But there have been some really big changes in that space. So of course we can learn a lot from our colleagues involved in terrestrial restoration through the Society of Ecological Restoration, for example. But also the Coral Restoration Consortium started in 2017 and now has thousands of members from around the world. I'm sure there's some listening today. So that's a great society of practice that's putting a lot of effort into sharing knowledge and building reports, tools, and information. And recently they put out collaboration with NOAA and others, the Coral Reef Restoration Monitoring Guide. So that's a great resource if you're looking to thinking about how you want to monitor your restoration project, as I know that many of you have restoration projects from the pole. Okay, we'll just click to the next one. So yeah, the third challenge is around a lot of the projects in the past perhaps have been driven by offsets or mitigation, just really focused on planting corals. And we're seeing quite a change towards a focus on restoring function and health. So some of the opportunities there look, better integration of keystone organisms, for example, fish or crustaceans. For example, some of the projects looking at macroalgae removal for coral restoration found that they got much better results when they were also either protecting the herbivores to help the macroalgae not come back, or even adding sea urchins to help keep the macroalgae down. Mixed method strategies to maximize species and functional diversity. And that's a really good, important point for this report as well, that there's not one perfect method that we're promoting above all others. It's really site specific, but also many of these methods can be used in combination. More physical restoration through processes of ecological engineering. And lastly, challenge 4 is linked with probably a lack of social ecological considerations, but I think that's really been changing in the last few years. And that's because, especially early on, a lot of the research, especially the research that we're able to get access to, which is through reports and scientific literature, was really driven by sort of research outcomes and permit limitations. So this could lead to some missed opportunities as we better understand the potential benefits, not just for the reef, but also for the people that depend on it. So the opportunities there, more opportunities for stewardship and education, community empowerment. So you're getting the local people the opportunity to look after their own resources, their own reefs. Having a platform for shared experiences and management approaches, and we're hoping that reports like this are part of that knowledge sharing. And maybe improve success tapping into traditional knowledge and experience as well, rather than always having things driven by the researchers. You know, people have been managing these reefs for thousands of years, and it's really important to learn lessons from those people. Thank you. I'll pass on to Margot now.
Great. Thanks, Ian and Gabriel, for introducing the first part of the reports, and for Liz and the Reef Resilience Network to give us the opportunity to present. It's quite exciting, especially since the report really just came out. I'll get right in and talk to you about the first section of our report, in which we really tried to tackle the big question of the worth of coral reef restoration in the face of climate change. And we called this section "To Restore or Not to Restore, a Call for Realism." And the main message from that section is that it really isn't an either-or situation, but rather that multiple actions are needed to be implemented concurrently to provide coral reefs with the greatest hope for the future. And that really is a central message to the report. The fact that we don't want to present coral reef restoration as the only tool or the tool to address global declines in coral reefs, but rather as one of the tools that's available to reef managers to help them better manage in the face of all those impacts that are happening. Now, the reality of global climate change is there, and we've experienced dramatic coral reef declines in the recent and recently. And so if people are going to use coral reef restorations, then we think that there's some key considerations to account for. First, the fact that it should never be labeled as a quick fix. It takes time. Absolutely should never be used as an excuse for degradation. It is also not a solution on its own, but rather needs to be integrated into resilience-based management framework and carefully planned with climate smart models. With that in mind, even if we stopped global emissions right at this minute, there would still be a lag, and corals are already living at the very upper limits of our thermal tolerance. And I think it's important to also acknowledge that coral reef restoration can have many benefits at local scales at the moment. These benefits include, for example, promoting genetic diversity and the potential for coral species to adapt and change, helping prevent species extinction, assist species migration, continue the provision of key ecosystem services, which is one of the main part of where this report is coming from, and finally also provide an opportunity for action. And we've heard a lot in the press and recently about the need to find actions to combat ecological grief. We can choose to just watch coral reef die, or we can try and do something about it. So that's in a nutshell the key messages that are in this section 3. Section 4, and arguably maybe one of the most important part of this report, has to do with recommendations. We first start with some general recommendations. The first one focusing on key questions to ask oneself prior to restoration, such as, is it worth it or is it necessary? And these questions are nothing new because they're really central to this document that was prepared by Alistair Edwards in 2010, the Reef Rehabilitation Manual. But here we focus on specific questions such as, what are the causes of reef degradation? Have the pressures been mitigated? Are there barriers to natural recovery, such as barriers to natural recruitment? Or can the reef recover on its own, in which case maybe you don't need to invest in coral reef restoration? And all those questions are also echoing the continuum of actions that Ian presented earlier, where we say again, coral reef restoration should be one of your last resort tool, one of your last resort action after you've thought about reducing impact and improving the management of your reef. Second recommendations have to do with planning and design, and they're based off the new managers guide that was produced by Liz Shaver just at the end of last year. And it's all about planning a smart approach that's based on goals. So try not to plan a coral reef restoration project just to do a coral reef restoration project, but go through specific steps that are highlighted in that guide and think of goals first and work from there. Third recommendation has to do with monitoring and communication. For monitoring, we highlight the need to better follow standards that have recently been developed by the Coral Restoration Consortium, for example. And most importantly, to again monitor against your goals and not necessarily for short-term techniques. And in that, I mean that in the past, we've seen a lot of projects monitor coral growth and coral survival in the first year and take nice pictures and call that a successful coral reef restoration project. We argue that we need to integrate metrics that relate to the goals and are more long-term than that. So for example, if the goal of your reef restoration project is to increase fisheries productivity, then you need to have metrics that relate to fish important species in that location. In terms of communication and collaboration, we argue for the need to better communicate on the success, but also on the failures, so that we can advance the field in the right direction. As both Gabriel and Ian mentioned, it's a very fast-moving field, and it's hard to know what works and doesn't work. And there's some really awesome resources out there to help us do that better, especially through the CRC and also the Reef Resilience Network. And this report, and I mean, we're communicating right now with this webinar with the Reef Resilience Network. So that's one example of how it can work. And we really hope that we can keep moving in this right direction of better communicating. We then develop recommendations that are based on goals specifically. So these recommendations were developed as key considerations to take into account when you design your restoration projects. So for each of the sub-goals that were developed in section 1, we have a time frame and key considerations. And the idea is that when you think about your coral restoration projects or any coral restoration projects, you look at the sub-goals and then you can have the key considerations. For example, if your goal is to use reef restoration as a way to mitigate impact and promote reef resilience through climate change, then you need to have a timeline of, at the very least, 3 to 5 years. In terms of site selection and project design, you should account for climate smart models and make sure that you have the best chance of success given projections of the impact of climate change at this location. For selecting the species to use for restoration, you should use local knowledge of resilient coral assemblages as well as functional redundancy. And then you should try to integrate as much as possible the latest research on coral adaptation mechanisms. We then have recommendations that are specific to methods. So here again, we have the 5 main categories of currently applied methods that Ian presented earlier, and another table, this time presenting key challenges and key recommendations for each of the current methods. Now, I think it's important to point out that the list of challenges and recommendations is non-exhaustive, but it's the list that we were able to narrow down with the 20+ experts that were involved in this report. And hopefully will give guidance, again, to people looking at using those methods as to where we stand out at the moment in terms of what to do and what not to do, or how to, best apply that method. So for example, if we look at the method of direct transplantation, key challenges highlighted are the fact that it can be expensive, the availability of diverse coral fragment as donor material might be limited or hard to have. And if you're going to use this method, it's going to be hard to scale up. It's mostly limited to small scale projects. In terms of recommendation, there's a few. The first one being that planting sites should be as similar as possible as donor sites. You should avoid planting during storm or bleaching season to give your corals the best chance of surviving. You should maximize diversity of fragments as much as possible, and by that we mean all kind of levels of diversity, from genetic diversity to phenotypic diversity to growth form diversity and so forth. For the attachment methods, you should invest time, make sure your corals are very securely attached, and use non-toxic materials or chemicals if possible. Try and use citizen science to reduce cost and increase engagement, and then have a plan to monitor and maintain the outplant site. Again, think long-term. Next, we tried to assess the current state of knowledge for each of those methods, and in terms of 3 parameters, which are cost, efficiency, and scalability. And that was to give additional guidance on helping choose a method for coral reef restoration, and help managers and practitioners or decision makers, have a clear overview of what we know about those methods. So we asked this time 11 experts to rate each of the methods in terms of cost, efficiency, and scalabilities on the scale from 0 to 10. And we came up with this violin plot, which allows us to have all the results in one frame. Now we realize that it can look a little bit complicated and might not be valuable for all the readers of the report, but we still thought that it could have some value to some and decided to include it. So for example, the way to read this, this plot, I'll give you an example for direct transplantation. So on the left-hand side, you have a little summary for cost, efficiency, and scalability of where we stand. And then on the right-hand side, you have the violin plot. So if we look at cost for direct transplantation, you can see that it's rated as average, a little lower than all the other methods if you want to compare. And the fact that there's a bulge around the average means that there was a consensus among experts as to the fact that this would generally be the cost you would expect for that method. In terms of efficiency now, you can see that it's quite a straight line, so we don't have as much consensus among experts, and it's average as well. Scalability, again, not really any consensus, and then it's average to low. If we focus on all the other methods, and we look at the trends, you can see that so far, with the current state of knowledge, experts are rating costs of all methods as average to high, efficiency and scalability as average to low. And that kind of really shows that we have a long way to go in the field to improve on those methods. But we're hoping that with all the current and future investment in research and development, and we hope to see more investment, we're going to be able to reverse that trend and hopefully also see other methods that might work better. So that was one way to kind of compare across all of the methods we're presenting in the report. Lastly, in the recommendations, we created this suitability index matrix, which allowed to link the methods to the goal. And we asked the experts involved in the preparation of this report to rate each of the methods from least appropriate to most appropriate in terms of each of the goals. So the darker the color, the most appropriate a method would be. So for example, if we look at the goal of mitigating population decline and preserving biodiversity, you can see that the two methods associated with larval-based restoration, so larval release or the deployment of inoculated substrates, are rated as most appropriate, which makes sense because they're the two methods that can really help maximize genetic diversity. They're followed by coral gardening. Direct transplantation is somehow appropriate, and then all the other methods would probably not be suitable if your goal was to mitigate population decline and preserve biodiversity. So we're hoping again that this index matrix allows to give this general overview of what method works for what goal. Okay, on to the conclusions for the report, starting with some general perspectives on the worth of reef restoration at the moment. There's a few we conclude on. The first being that whilst it's not designed to mitigate climate change, coral restoration can be a useful tool to support reef resilience, and that especially at local scales. It's important that it shouldn't be mislabeled as a standalone short-term fix, but instead incorporated into resilience-based management strategies. So not take away investment and interest from other solutions and other management strategies, but rather be integrated as an additional tool that can help reef recover. We highlight lots of challenges, most of them linked to the novelty of the field and the sense of urgency. And we think that any efforts must be carefully planned with resilience and climate smart design in mind to maximize the chance of success. Now, these perspectives led to 5 specific recommendations if coral restoration is to be used. The first one is that it should be integrated with threats and disturbance abatement strategies. Reef restoration efforts should incorporate projection of climate change impact and site vulnerabilities. We should consider important ecosystem processes, such as the prevalence of diseases, the physical integrity of the reef, and connectivity of key species in the choice of site and methods. We should engage stakeholders and maximize socioeconomic benefits to local communities, and that as much as possible, and monitor to allow for adaptive management and better communication of outcomes. So these are the key recommendations. They also align with the latest recommendations from the Society of Ecological Restoration. And the last recommendations we have are policy recommendations. The first one being that coral reef restoration targets should be included as commitments as part of the UN Decade on Ecosystem Restoration. Gabriel mentioned that the decade just started. It's going to run from 2021 to 2030. And we're very lucky and proud to have this report being the first report released as part of the decade, because the decade was mostly designed around terrestrial ecosystem, and we really hope that we can put marine systems and coral reefs especially in more of a spotlight in this arena. And following this first policy recommendation, the next one is that policy plans and funding that are specific to coral reef restoration are needed to assist implementation at local, regional, and global scales. And that second policy recommendation is coming out of the ICRI report from last year, where ICRI members are really asking for those briefings, so policy plans and fundings to help assist broader implementation. Okay, so that's for the bulk of the report. The other thing that we have in this report are 6 case studies of global coral reef restoration efforts to highlight best practices. So not just abstract recommendation, but case studies that can hopefully inspire and give practical examples. We're very fortunate to have had experts around the world give us a bit of our time to share their experiences and stories. And these case studies will also be made available on the Reef Resilience Network website. But I'll show you a sneak peek of those in the next few slides, and hopefully they'll inspire you to read them in more details. The first case studies is the Coral Nurture Program that was written by David Suggett. The program is based in Australia on the Great Barrier Reef with the objective of developing low-cost approaches to coral reef restoration that could be championed by the tourism industry. The project was started in 2018, and as of May 2020, they already had established over 50 nurseries and planted over 17,000 corals across 6 high-value tourism sites. They now entered a new phase of the project. It's been a little slowed down with COVID, but still, and they aim to involve even more tourism operators as well as traditional owners to scale up their efforts. Second case studies is the eco-designed mooring project that was written by Sylvain Pioche. And this case study describes efforts based in Guadeloupe to design a mooring system that has the dual objective to reduce the impact from boat anchors, but also serve as an artificial substrate for corals and associated organisms. So at the beginning of our project, they tested different designs and found that one that was modeled after mangrove roots was the most efficient for recruiting corals. They did monitoring 6 years after the beginning of the project and were able to show that 52% of the local coral species had recruited on the moorings. And they also had attracted over 40 different species of fish. And their last success result was that the moorings and the recruited corals survived Hurricane Irma in 2017, which goes to show that the project is robust. Case study number 3 is written by Bugi Rikovich. It describes long-term outcomes of repeated restoration efforts in the Gulf of Eliat in Israel. This really is a flagship coral reef restoration project. It's led by a wonderful pioneer of the field, and we're very fortunate to have him participate. The study describes different phases of restoration over 15 years, included the development of nurseries to grow 8 local species of corals, challenges they went through, especially in terms of permitting, and then their transplantation phase, which was focused on ecological engineering with repeated planting phases every year and a half. Case study number 4 presents the development of the Mission Iconic Reef project in the Florida Keys and is written by Tom Moore. This case study is focused on the process of designing the project. And that includes defining specific goals and objectives, the type of analysis that went into site and method selection, including the consideration of local novelty of actions, such as the reintroduction of grazers to balance algae overgrowth, as well as their plans for funding and for building stewardship and collaboration. It's very interesting to see this development design aspect of a project. Case study number 5 describes a trial of large-scale coral reef restoration in Okinawa, Japan, and is written by Tadashi Kimura and colleagues. Japan has been involved in restoration efforts for quite some time now, but unfortunately, most of our outputs are in Japanese, which makes it really hard for them to communicate their success and lessons learned with other people around the world. And we're super fortunate to have had Tadashi take the time to write and share this case study. The study is mainly focused on describing methods of larval-based restoration to produce lots of juvenile coral colonies that were later transplanted on reefs at various locations around Okinawa Islands. And they describe the whole process, including the pilot studies and research on genetic diversity and so forth. And finally, case study number 6 is written by Austin Bowden Kirby and presents efforts of coral reef restoration for climate change adaptation in the South Pacific. Austin is another very respected pioneer of coral reef restoration efforts. Again, very fortunate to have his expertise for the writing of this report. In this case study, it describes a strategy focused on harnessing naturally built-in resilience for restoration. So, for example, selecting corals that have already survived severe bleaching events and first would have some built-in resilience traits. His work is based in a number of islands in the South Pacific, including Fiji, Kiribati, Tuvalu, Samoa, Vanuatu, and French Polynesia. And he also describes his work with working and training the local communities in these efforts. So lots of great case studies to read if you're interested. And with that, I would like to end with a massive, massive thank you and shout of gratitude to all the many people involved in the preparation of this report. We all hope that it will be a great resource for many. And the report, the brief, the video are all available to download on the new ICRI Restoration Hub at icriforum.org/coral restoration. And we'll happily now take any questions.
Thanks, Margot, Ian, and Gabriel. That was a really great overview of the report. And I'd love to allow the audience to ask some questions at this point. So I guess, Gabriel, if you wanted to turn on your camera too to join us in the Q&A, that'd be great. And we do have a few questions already that came in during the presentation. The first one, I'll ask a question from the question box, and then I see that there's some hands raised as well. So I'll kind of go back and forth between those questions. But one question that we had come in was under the, in the beginning, under the Reef methods where you present on this continuum between proactive and reactive. Similar to algae removal, there was a question of whether, sorry, of whether removal of predators or other disturbances like ship wreckage and those things, if those are included in there, or how you kind of consider different methods to include on that continuum.
Ian, do you wanna answer, since that was your?
Oh, sure. So we had predator control, such as crown of thorn starfish control, sort of straddling across proactive and reactive. So it sort of depends on your context. It could be proactive if you're getting in early before you've got a major outbreak, but it'll definitely fall into reactive. Yeah, sort of around in the middle.
Great, thanks. Okay, so there's a hand raised by Hasanti that's been raised for a while. So I'm going to go ahead and, oh, okay, yeah, I'm going to go ahead and unmute you, Hasanti, and then on your end, I think you also need to unmute yourself. Would you like to ask a question? You can click the microphone icon that's next to your name, Hasanti, if you want to ask a question. Okay, well, we'll come back to you. But we do have another question from Ivan Cano. If you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, you hear me?
Yes, we do.
Yeah, I'm Ivan from Spain, and I wish to ask, what is your opinion about the studies of Madeleine Van Open and his paper building coral reef resilience through assisted evolution?
I can answer that one.
Yeah, you go, Margo, if you want.
And you can give me back up, Ian, if you want to. I will. I personally, I'll speak for myself. I think it's a wonderful paper. There's lots of really good work that's being produced by that lab and lots of others now, and it all fits into this research that's happening in terms of developing the capacity for corals to adapt to climate change, to build resilience, and we hope that these techniques that are developed in the lab will be available for field implementation pretty soon. I realize that it creates a lot of controversy and a lot of people are scared of those things, but if you think of the broader picture and the fact that these methods have been applied on land for decades now, I personally really don't see why we can't explore these techniques for corals.
Yeah. And in Australia, these are some of the techniques which are being investigated as part of the Reef Restoration Adaptation Program. But a really strong, important part of that program, I'm sure with other research programs around the world, is really thorough risk assessments before any deployment. So it's a really staged and careful approach with new interventions.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks for that question. I'm going to go back to some of the questions in the question box. We had a comment and a question. The comment was, thanks for this really great guidance. It's going to fill a long-standing gap. And the question was, is there a process for making sure that big donor agencies or funding sources get this guide and I think get the recommendations within it, because I think the question is really revolving around the fact that donors need to understand some of the constraints and benefits of the nature of this work.
I'm happy to take that one. That's okay. Yeah, so at the United Nations Environment Programme, we work very closely with some of the major environmental donors in the world, and of course, this guidance will go to them to try and broaden their understanding of the challenges and the opportunities of coral restoration. I would like to give one very pertinent example, which is now the development of a global fund for coral reefs, which is ongoing at the moment. We launched it in September last year at the UN General Assembly, and which will run hopefully for the next 10 years, and which hopefully will provide elevated amounts of funding for coral protection and coral restoration. And we hope that this guide will be an important document in informing the decisions made under the fund. So absolutely, it's one of the intentions of this document. Thank you.
And
Thanks,
if I can
Gabriel.
add, we also have Ian mentioned a policy brief that was released as part of the report, and the policy brief is a 3-page summary that highlights all those key concepts and recommendations. And so we're trying to make it easy for people who don't want to read the 40 pages of the report to still access the information at a glance.
Great, thank you guys. We have another hand raised. Rico, would you like to, I just unmuted you. Go ahead and ask your question.
Hello from Hong Kong, and yeah, just wanted to say thank you. I've read a lot of the reports and resources shared by Reef Resilience Network, and also Ian, Mark, and Gabriel. I've also read your work. I really appreciate it. So my question is, I feel the lack of development of restoration in Southeast Asia, especially in China, but there's a lot of efforts and financial efforts put in the area, which is, I would say, not quite well considered. I see there's a huge knowledge gap in the area. I wonder, how would you guys think about filling up the gap, and also if there's any specific suggestions for us working in this developing area in terms of coral restoration?
Yeah, I can take that one. Well, thank you for your questions, and thank you for following up from Hong Kong. Might be quite late for you at the time, so thanks for making the time. You're like Ian, a late night. Well, I think it's wonderful to see, how many efforts are springing out and coming out. One of the key goal of this report was to assist exactly what you're asking, and making sure that those projects are carefully thought through, and hopefully, help guide the key questions that you should think of, and really try and design them properly. I think my main recommendations for these projects would be to follow the manager's guide that was recently published in November by Liz Shaver and a lot of other people. And it's quite a long guide, but it's absolutely wonderful. It has 7 iterative steps that you can go through in terms of really thinking through how your goals and selecting your sites and selecting your methods. And it comes with a workbook to put together an action plan. And so I think that would be a good way to start. And then encourage those groups and people were coming up with those projects to really join the Coral Restoration Consortium and communicate and collaborate. I think it's quite open field at the moment, and everybody is happy to help. And so don't hesitate to reach out, and we're all happy to jump in.
It's cool. Thank you.
Thanks. If I could, go ahead, Ian. No, yeah, please go ahead.
I think I know what you're going to talk about as well, which is I was just going to say the policy brief is translated into all the UN languages, so that we one communication device. I just wanted to note as well that the updated global guidelines for shellfish restoration were actually paid for out of China through the Nature Conservancy and have been translated into Chinese as well as English. So there's good precedent as well for really close collaboration and partnership with China as well.
It's cool. I'm not aware of that. I will try to look it up. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. I think you read my mind. I was going to say that we're going to translate at least the policy brief into all the UN languages, which includes Chinese, of course. As UNEP, we do have kind of a network of partnerships around the world. We have regional offices in Asia as well. We have regional seas programs in all the major coral reef regions. And we're always happy to work with stakeholders in the region on restoration projects and on providing technical advice and providing expertise through our networks and through our tools and approaches. So we're very, very happy if people contact us, and very happy to collaborate. Thanks.
Cool. Thanks for the advice and being open to collaborate. Thank you.
Great. Thanks so much for your question. We have another from the question box, actually a few on this topic. So the question is about whether the report is limited to shallow water coral restoration, and whether these methods are applicable, or the guidelines are applicable when considering mesophotic or even deep benthic coral communities.
Ian, I see you nod. You can take that question.
Oh, I'm just thinking that's a very good question. I think most of the experience with coral restoration to date has been focused on shallow water environments that you can dive in, particularly, up to about 20 meters. I did see a paper last year about deep sea restoration being the next frontier, but that was, the challenges with doing anything in the ocean are huge, and so I think that following the manager's guide or taking away some of the key messages away from this report will be really valuable. But I guess it depends what you're talking about with deep water. But I think things definitely get more challenging as you get deeper. But some of the new interventions, which are less focused on diver deployment, may be one of the opportunities to think about going deeper.
We have another hand. Another hand raised. Well, let me see if Hasanthi, do you want to try again? Your hand is still raised, so I'm going to unmute you again and see if you wanted to ask your question. Okay, if not, we have another hand raised. Mohammed Reza Shokri. Let me unmute you. Do you want to ask your question? Oh, it looks. Hasanthi, is that you?
I would like to thank everyone for great talks. I really enjoyed the talks you guys gave us, and I've got a question. I'm wondering how I can get access to that mooring case study that you raised as your case study. And my second question is, I am from Iran, and we have got access to coral reefs of the Persian Gulf, which is the world's warmest sea in the world. And we are planning to have a restoration project in Fish Island. And for this purpose, I'm wondering if anyone has tried to limit their efforts, to just focus on those species that are thermally tolerant instead of, going for fast growing branching ones. Thanks.
Great. Thanks so much for your questions. The first one about the case studies. Well, you can read them in the report, which you can download from the link on the screen, well, at the ICRI forum /Coral Reef Restoration. But they will also be made available on the Reef Resilience Network website. So if you go on the Reef Resilience Network website, there's a whole tab about case studies. And so you can follow the case studies there, and there's linked to the report that's been written about this case study in particular, as well as the contact details of the person who wrote the case study for you to get in touch with them if you would like more information. For your second question about using a more resilient type of corals, yes, there has been some studies doing this. The last case study number 6, is really focused on that, and I think that's definitely a good way forward in thinking of when we think about climate-based models in the design of your restoration efforts. It used to say that, being realistic about what the reefs are likely to look like in 5, 10, 50 years, and then it goes to your goals. So if you want to still have high coral cover, and if you want to have ecosystem services associated with them, you might want to focus on those resilient species. And I think that's a great way to think in the early stages.
Just the only thing I'd add as well is from our global review, we came with the assumption that that pretty much all the projects were focused on a few branching, fast-growing coral species. We actually found that over 200 species had been using coral restoration around the world. So, yeah, that was one of the surprises from that review.
Great, thank you guys. We have another hand raised. Adrian Villegas, would you like to ask your question?
Yes, hi, good morning. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, so I'm from Mexico. I live in Cozumel Island. So probably you heard of this very popular destination, so where we have plenty of visitors from around the world every year. So the problem is that I've noticed that the quality of water, of coastal seawater, is quite poor, and it's a kind of a widespread spread problem across the Riviera Maya, which is across a few kilometers from our island. So my question would be, that is, if you are aware of a successful management project anywhere in the world where, like, the government or NGO or anyone was able to solve this kind of problem, the polluted water. In Mexico, what happens is that we have this all the sewage that gets dumped into the aquifer, either legally or illegally, which is either untreated or poorly treated. So the quality of water that reaches the coastal zone is quite bad. And actually, in my opinion, that's the main reason of coral reef degradation in the area. So I would like to know if you have any insights about the successful management programs around the world. I don't know if you.
I can jump in. I'm just wondering if there's any examples of the Reef Resilience Network, other resources to link to. There might be the best go-to. So I'm not sure, Liz.
Yeah, I can step in really quickly on this one. We actually have an entire series on ocean sewage pollution that's happening right now. A webinar every month for about a year, and there's going to be pages on our website and online courses as well. It's part of a really big push to share globally, not just for coral reef ecosystems, but all ecosystems, the impact of ocean sewage. So I will put a link to the webinars, to those webinars, that series, in the chat box. And we also send out announcements on our newsletter. But feel free to contact me if you have other questions about that, or send an email to resilience@tnc.org.
All right, thank you.
Let's see. So we have a few, let's see, a couple questions on this topic. So I wanted to get your thoughts on this. But regarding the use of methods to mitigate bleaching or other kind of harmful environmental conditions, there have been some questions about what good methods are in terms of restoration for that, or what your views are on potentially the challenges or the benefits of those methods.
You're talking in terms of the new R&D mitigation.
I think so.
kid cloths and mixing waters and things like this. Well, I can start. There's some wonderful thinking happening over there. I think that, you know, 2 years ago when people first started discussing them, people were like, oh my God, you're crazy. This is never going to work. And why are we even thinking of that? I think we need to think outside the box, and we need to again think of the big picture. I'm going to say the big picture, but I want you to think global scales. And so for that, I'm thinking that those methods might be really helpful at very specific location, what we call high value reef sites. So if you think of a tourism site, I'm thinking of the Great Barrier Reef, where they have those platforms. You're not going to be able to move the platform. Those reefs, you know, they're the whole livelihood of the local economy. And if they are out of the box solutions like this that can help locally mitigate the impact of bleaching, I think they're worth considering. And yes, they'll be expensive to put in the water, but in the end, they'll be worth it in terms of the ecosystem services that they might help save. But there's still a lot of research and development happening in that figure that Ian showed. We mentioned that, you know, they're still years to decade away from being ready to be deployed. So it's a process, and I hope we'll know more in the coming months to 2 years.
Yeah, if I could also jump in for this. So what I would say is that, you know, coral restoration and good management, I mean, at the end of the day, the biggest threat to coral reefs is still climate change and greenhouse gas emissions. And you know, we as a global community, we have to address that. You know, that's the driver of degradation. And if that is not addressed, then a lot of restoration efforts around the world are ultimately going to fail. So, you know, the number one kind of action is really to move to a carbon neutral or a low carbon economy, and to achieve the Paris Agreement and to go even beyond the Paris Agreement and to put pressure on governments to achieve the goals that they've set out for themselves, and to go beyond the goals, because even the current kind of targets for nations on greenhouse gas emissions are still insufficient to first of all reach the Paris Agreement, and second of all definitely for coral reefs. So that, you know, number one is we have to, you know, that's all this work is also dependent on the global community actually achieving its goals on climate change. Secondly, there's also some really interesting work on trying to understand where bleaching events are going to occur around the world. Climate projections, using climate data and projecting into the future, downscaling that data as much as possible to understand what might be happening at different reef sites. Of course, these models are not perfect and they're not going to be 100% accurate, but there are, you know, we just put out a report recently on bleaching futures and which reefs around the world might be more vulnerable to coral bleaching in the coming decades, and which coral reefs might be less vulnerable to coral bleaching in the coming decades. And of course, that can also give you an idea of where you might want to focus your restoration efforts and where you might want to focus your management and conservation efforts. You know, we might want to start looking at trying to protect the reefs that have the best chance of survival in the coming decades, you know, given climate projections. And it's some difficult decisions to make, but it's something that I think every restoration and you know, kind of coral reef practitioner has to think about very seriously and try to understand as well. Thanks.
Okay, thanks, everyone. Christine Yang Weso, would you like to ask your question?
Yeah, good evening, good morning, wherever people are across the world. My name is Christine from Kenya. I would like to ask about coral reef restoration. It seems to be a good project, and how are other countries taking it? Did you require to have greater stakeholder meeting, consultation with the local people to be engaged in the restoration projects? And also, how easy was it to convince the conservation organization within the other countries that are doing it successfully? Because in Kenya, I've read about it in Wasini towards Kisite. It has been happening, but now the project is not long-term. Sustainability. At the end of the donor fund, what next? Because local people are given like monetary motivation to participate in the restoration programs. Then at the end of the funding, what happens? Do we go back to zero? And then what is the long-term agenda into coral reef restoration in line to economic valuation of coral reef ecosystem? That is my main interest in research. Yeah, so maybe if I get some clarification on that. Thank you.
I don't mind starting. Thanks very much. That was really interested, and there's a few different questions within that. The first one, as far as I heard, it was focused on around the world, what's the approach with working with local people. I'd say that it's quite mixed, and that there's an increased focus we're learning with conservation and restoration around the world that if you're not including the local people and their needs, you're really unlikely to have long-term success. So I think it's been mixed in the past, but I'm expecting to see a lot more engagement and opportunities for involvement of the local communities, particularly if we move away from sort of restoration being get in there, replanting your fix, to we're going to have to nurture this local environment for the next couple of decades while we fix the climate. The other two main areas was convincing or talking about restoration for that sort of conservation managers. I think that's a really interesting question that I will pass over to Gabriel for here as well, that speaks to policy and permitting. So that's also a sort of a big change we've been seeing as well. In Australia, where I work, our government has just released a new interventions policy to really provide the policy framework to support restoration activities. Whereas before, just a few years ago, before a couple of major bleachings in the Great Barrier Reef, restoration just wasn't even allowed. And now it's actually being done by the government themselves. So that's something we're seeing changing, but Gabriel, you probably have a bit more context about that, and then also about the economic valuation.
Yeah, thanks, Ian. Actually, you mentioned the Wasini Kisite restoration project. I've actually visited it. I was there in 2019, and it's the reefs around that area are some of the best in Kenya, so it's really a beautiful, beautiful place. But the issue that you raised was on sustainability. And I think that's critical for all the, for any restoration project. Margot mentioned that you need to, think about monitoring long term. And you raised a very good point about donor funding and, project to project funding, and, what happens when the donor money runs out. What happens to these projects? Do they just disappear? So financial sustainability is a critical component of designing a project. You don't want to be dependent on donor funding forever. Now, in the case, for example, of Wasini Kisite, the fishing community there are looking or are developing a locally managed marine area where they are, kind of going to, officially become stewards of the coral reef area in collaboration with the government, with the Kenya Wildlife Service. And they can start maybe charging, kind of tourism fees for people who are going to dive and snorkel in that area. So this restoration project could potentially be supported through a mechanism like that. I mean, that's just one example. There's, there's other, there's lots of examples of payment for ecosystem services schemes where, stewards of an ecosystem are paid by an entity, be it individuals, be it a company, be it a government, to protect, manage, restore an ecosystem in order for it to continue providing the important services to the global good, to the community. So there's many examples of this. Kind of sustainable eco-based tourism is one of them. The carbon market is another one that doesn't really apply to coral reefs, but it does apply to mangroves, for example. So there are, you know, this building in this idea of financial sustainability is certainly critical, I think, and it's a very good point. Thanks. I think I'll stop there.
Great. Thank you, guys. Here's another question for you. From ecosystem services and the perspective of climate resilience, do you guys have any thoughts on what are some realistic expectations of reef restoration programs to build climate change resilience in the next 5 to 10 years?
I might start off with this one. But it does link again in with you, Liz. I mean, I've had the real privilege to work with some of the US jurisdictions as they go through restoration planning using the manager's guide. And you know, part of the process for the manager's guide is to think about climate smart restoration practices. And so, you know, we were seeing all sorts of plans in place. So, I mean, just a couple of really small examples for your nursery area where you grow your corals out. You know, if it's going to be particularly warm, you can either drop that to deeper, cooler water. And in some areas, they're also shading their nursery areas to sort of protect those areas from bleaching. So those are some really small scale actions that I heard of. But I wouldn't mind passing to Liz a little bit as well there as well. Perhaps you might just want to touch on some of the guidance within the manager's guide there.
Sure, yeah, I'm happy to. In the manager's guide, we took an approach to planning that was really thinking also about climate change and about climate adaptation. We took a lot of guidance from the adaptation design tool, which is freely available. And I'll share a link in the chat box for that as well. That's on the NOAA website, also on the Reef Resilience Network website. But essentially, it helps you think through how climate change is going to impact both your restoration project as well as the restoration interventions themselves, and to kind of forecast that in your area, what the climate vulnerabilities look like in your area, and to try to take those considerations into mind and design your interventions and your restoration project to hopefully withstand or be able to adapt to those those future climate conditions, I should say. I don't really have specific examples. There's in the manager's guide, there's actually a full worked example of a restoration project, and it's taken through every single step. It includes that climate adaptation design considerations and those questions. So I would recommend kind of looking at that as well as the adaptation design tool, which is, both of those are kind of a series of questions to think about in terms of climate considerations and design considerations. Okay, I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in, or I can ask the next question. All right, we'll get to the next question. Bernadette, you have your hand up, and I'm going to go ahead and unmute you to ask your question if you'd like to unmute yourself as well.
Good morning. Good morning from Canada. So a question was raised earlier about sustainable financing, and what I would like to know is if you have any case studies that deal specifically with examples of successful stewardship and adaptive management through local communities. So we all know that the success of any such project really depends on the involvement of the local people. How do you sustain that effort over time? Any examples of that?
I think that's a wonderful question. I wish, I'm trying to think of the case studies we present in the report. I think case study number 6 has this heavy focus on local community involvement in the South Pacific. So that's the case study by Austin, Bott, and Kirby. And there it really, trains the local community members to become the local reef stewards, to become the people that are later employed in the hotel businesses, to manage the coral reef restoration programs and also educate tourists and locals. So that's one case study from the report. I know of this project in Indonesia called Coral Guardian that was designed based on the idea for coral restoration to become an alternative livelihood for the local fishermen. So originally the fishermen were fishing with dynamite and destroying the reefs, and that program came in and gave them an education program, and then also trained them, and then later paid them to restore the reef. So instead of destroying it, they're now coral gardeners, and there's a whole business plan associated with it that has evolved around the years. And I think you can check their website; they explain that pretty well. And I'm sure there's other examples of the top of my head. I don't have any, but it's definitely, we say long term. We really insist on the long term aspect of coral reef restoration in this report, and we hope that this will also guide funding agencies to think of grants and funding as long term. So it might be the same amount of money, but distributed over 10-15 years rather than just in 1 year to help the project, build and develop long term.
Well, that's precisely the nature of the question, because we speak a lot about the methodology around coral restoration, but the financing models that would be required for the long-term sustainability of these projects, I think that is where information gap actually does exist.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's also a huge information gap on the funding for coral reef restoration projects and how they're funded, who funds them, what kind of funding is available. And it's actually a project we're currently working in. So there will be a new report hopefully coming this year, looking to answer those questions.
Thank you very much.
So we already have the next study lined up. That's awesome.
Yeah.
Great. Well, thank you everyone so much for all of your questions. We do have a couple more, so I will try to get those answered and posted on the Reef Resilience Network forum as well, so you can check there later for some of these additional remaining questions. But with that, we're at time, and I just wanted to take a minute to thank again our three presenters. Thank you all so much for sharing your a summary of this guide, and the link to that report has been shared in the chat. And thank you everyone for attending the webinar today and asking all of your great questions. Hopefully we can carry on this conversation on the forum and elsewhere, because there's a lot of interest in this space, and I think a lot of work that is yet to come. I hope everyone has a nice rest of their day or their night or wherever they are in the world. Thank you all again for joining us today.
Thanks, Liz, and thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank